Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome all of our new and regular attendees to Intabor Institute's webinar, The Risk Register and How to Use It. As a brief introduction, my name is Michael Trumper. I'm one of the partners here at Intabor Institute, and I've been working in the area of project, risk management, and software development for over 20 years. The webinar will include both slides and a live demonstration, and is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our website within 48 hours. If you'd like to get a copy of that. And just before we start, I'm just going to go. I normally do what you call housekeeping, which is how you can participate in the webinar. It's limited, but we do allow it. So you should see up on the right-hand corner, the little pane. These are my preferred settings, mic and speakers. The audio tends to be much better, and there's a question pane at the bottom. You can ask questions during the presentation, and we will answer them as quickly as we can at the end of the webinar in the order that they came in. If you have a technical issue that you can't hear or you can't see, there's some sort of technical issue, if you post it in, we'll take a look at that and try and resolve it as soon as possible. But like we said, there'll be a question and answers at the end of the webinar if you do have some questions. So the reason that we chose this topic for the webinar, it's often common for us to see some users who are unaware of how the risk register works and how they can configure it to meet the requirements for assessment and so what we want to do is sort of just go over today what you might be looking at, your considerations, what the main components are that you can set up and modify to meet. I'll do a look at the difference between and how it reacts and what you can see in there between qualitative versus quantitative and what you might want to be using for both of those depending on what you're using the software for. And then we'll do some we'll look at the customization, sort of how you can use in a little bit more detail than perhaps you're aware of. So to get started, oh, got that. So considerations. So these are just a little bubble clouds about things you might consider about when you're setting up the risk register, how you're going to identify it. And identification is not, this risk is, and a risk statement, it includes a lot of different other things, who, what, when, where, how. It could be, are you going to have, what is the risk ID? Are you going to have a risk ID? Are you going to generate it? You can generate one automatically, or do you want to sort of hand code it in? Do you want to, what sort of information about the risk that helps you identify? Who's the manager? When was it identified? Who? A lot of these things will get recorded automatically by the system. Like when was it first identified? That will get populated, and you can view that if you want. But how do you want to set that up? Who? What? Locations. There's the divisions. All these sorts of things, and these are properties that you want to track to help you identify that risk, where it's occurring, when it might start, when sunset, sunrise, sunset, all of these different things. And we have some of it hard coded, but you can modify that quite a bit. And these two here are somewhat related: assessment and scoring. how are you going to assess the risk? Are you going to use, if you're doing it quantitatively, then it's going to be and you're used to that, you're doing risk assignments and it's percentage wise. If you're doing it qualitatively, are you going to be doing 1 to 5, with a 5 by 5 matrix, or you can have something differently? How are you going to be ranking severities or severity rankings if you're using the risk matrix? And the scoring. Scoring can be, there's a couple different hard-coded ways to set up that scoring or the severity ranking, if you want to call that. There's the scoring that's in the risk register view that you can see, but there's also scoring that you might, or ranking you see on the risk matrix, and all of that can be customized a bit to meet your requirements. Planning, it might be around basically a mitigation. We won't go too much into it, but there are a couple new views with the latest version that we can take a look at. But are you going to be doing sort of in-depth planning? Are you going to use the mitigation waterfall charts, or are you just going to write down, create a property that says what you're going to do? It's that can be part of it as well. And reporting. Again, what are you going to use in the reporting out of the risk system? Is it going to be, are you going to just use the risk register? Are you going to use the risk matrix? Are you going to use the risk report? All of these things can be configured and made so that you can sort of get the reports out that you would. So we'll do a dive into the main components of the risk system in terms of how the configuring, how you configure the risk system. And that includes the categories, properties, and we call it's the format risk matrix is what we call it, but that's a risk scoring and assessment piece of it. We'll look at quantitative versus qualitative. We've got it backwards here. Qualitative on the right, on the left here, versus quantitative on the right. And I just put in that little histogram, obviously not really part of it. It does mean you're looking at different types of analysis. And then we'll look at sort of customizing views. So I'm just going to switch over. We'll go right into the app. We'll go right into the demonstration. So this is basically if I open up a new file, this is the default settings that you have in the risk register. And it has some built-in, so this is the built-in view. If we go down to the other parts of that, is you can sort of look at the risk dashboard. I won't go into that because that's something a little bit different. But the risk matrix, standard risk matrix, risk trend. So these might be some of the major views. The risk report is also got if you ever use this, it's sort of a risk sheet, and it has a standard customization on that as well. What we want to do is say, if you do see a lot of times is what people go in and they start off and they haven't sort of gone in, and there's ways that you can modify things to make things a little bit easier. I call it as much as required, as little as possible, especially sometimes around risk categories. And so what I'm going to do is just go through typically what I would do if I'm going to set up a risk register at the very beginning, and considerations I'm going to go through. The first thing that we want to do when we set up the risk is go into the risk categories. Now, and these are, because we also have the hard-coded built-in impacts. These are different types of impacts for the Monte Carlo simulation. We can't really do anything about it. However, if you're tracking any of the other categories, we have all of these ones, and there's 7, I think, or anyways, additional categories. The problem with these, one of the issues you can have with these is if we go in and we're looking at what that does is it populates all of these drop-down lists in the system, and it can kind of clog it up a little bit. You can see the same sort of thing if we're adding or modifying columns, and we go into here and we'll follow that. You can see that all of these different risk categories generate possible properties that you can put or data that you can add to your risk register. And we can see that right here. And so when you're adding risks or you're identifying, you're adding them, a lot of times you'll get all of these properties or outcomes, we call them risk categories, that you don't need. And it just a lot of times it makes it harder to sort of navigate through some of these drop-down lists. So what we like to do is go in and remove as many as possible that you're not going to use. So we'll just go and let's see if we can delete these. I'm not sure if I had any assessments on. If you've already started an assessment, one of the things that'll happen is that if you've identified a risk and assessed it on one of these things, it might change it. You can also change these if I wanted to call, just instead of having 2 things, I could just call this QHSE. We actually have to have what we call an outcome and an outcome type. Sorry, an outcome type and an outcome, and I'll just call this a QHSE. So this is, you can quickly change this. So it is, so my recommendation when the first time you open up the application and you do want to start using the risk register as part of your process is you go in and you the first thing to do is actually change or modify the risk categories to remove any that you don't need, and so we'll just have 3 in here. And if we go back into there, you'll see what happens here. So now we only have those lists. So it simplifies some of the selection options that you have. Is to go in and clean that out for all the categories you know, and maybe add if the category, you can add those categories in. So that would be the first thing we would do. The second thing we want to do is on the identification is the default properties. Now properties are these that we see across here. Some of these are going to be hard coded in, but again, when we look at these are all these properties that can be added. And we want to go in to default properties and again, see if a lot of times if we're importing a risk register from another source, you'll sort of do a mapping and look for and a gap analysis. Do we have all the properties? Do we need to add some? Can I remove some? The hard-coded properties that we have that we can't get out are these ones in gray. So these can't be, there's nothing we can do about it. It just says the name of it and it says what the value is. The ones that are in white, we can delete. And I always recommend that if you're not going to be using a property that's in here, get rid of it. Because again, it's going to populate all these drop-down lists and again, make it a little bit more difficult during setup, trying to find all the properties you want to when you're sort of adding it to a view or something, or during assessment when you're going in, here's the risk and I want to go through and I want to add these different properties because these are the ones. you'll start to get a whole bunch of different ones, and you want to have that, again, as much as required, as little as possible. If you want to add a property, it's fairly simple. I'm going to call this the new webinar property. And then I can say what type of data it is, and it can be string, integer, real number, resource. It could, if you have a schedule with resources in it, actually populate it with those resources for specific resources. Date could be risk, cost. There's these other ones. It can be a pick list, or if you want to have a simple pick list, it'd be yes and no. If I wanted to create a pick list here, I can define it, and call it yes, no, and no, and to be determined. That I can go in and I can look at here and go, okay, new webinar property. I can add that, and we can see that. So I've added that. So again, when we go through another, clean out the risk categories, make sure and do the same in the properties. We have a lot of hard-coded ones. A lot of these will be and they're grayed out. They'll be grayed out in here. It's a lot of time they're generated by the system. Other ones you are editable, but we want to go through and clean out any of these that are you're not going to be using, because we just to simplify the views and the sort of what's available there. Next, and probably the most important, is the format risk matrix. Now, this has changed a little bit with version 7.2, which came out in June. It has several areas in this. So there's obviously right here, this sets up the risk cube for probabilities and impacts. All of these labels can be changed. Why would you change them? Well, that you can view them in the system. Let's just see if we have it on. You can see, so you can actually provide some sort of guidance for people, or they can be used, these labels can be used as actual inputs to the system. There is the risk matrix itself, and it's customizable. You can customize the colors. Let's say, for instance, we wanted to put, which we do see commonly now, for high impact, low probability risks. People want to, they'll put a tail down here, I call it. That's because that anything, it may be the guidance in the system, in the company or organization, that anything that lands in the red is considered critical, and you need to have some sort of deeper analysis, maybe have a mitigation or some sort of risk planning around it. So you can change the colors. We can change the number of cells in a risk cube. Simply this, so if we want to have a 4x5, we can do this. You can see the math there is sort of changed. You would have to change the ranges on here, because everything has to add up to 100%. I'm just going to restore the defaults. We can change what these ranges mean. So by default, it's regular 20%, 20%. And actually, when you add, let's say if I added 1 and a 1, it would be actually quantitatively it takes a mid-range. So each one represents, 1 would represent 10%, 30%, 50%, because it's taking that mid-range or the average of it, if you want to call it, of that. But you can change that. And typically, we're going to see that when you're doing some sort of quantitative analysis, if you're going to use the risk matrix, and I'll show that in a bit, a setup that we have, so that it better reflects how the risk, the criticality of or severity of the risk, because in quantitative analysis, the risk matrix does not work particularly well. One of the other things that we, and I'm just going to, just for demonstration purposes, add a 4th color as well. To show you how that changes. So the other thing that we've added in here is that we also have some users who want to prioritize the risk score of impact over probability, and they will and they create new math where in this case 4 times 5 here equals 23. I think this is 1, and this one equals I think it's 21 is what they did. And you can do that, and that actually will override. It will override the basic math that we do with when you're doing qualitative risk analysis for like where you're using 4 times 5 or 3 times 2 with these. So I'm just going to reset that, but that's what these are for. So they're editable. So if that's one of the things that you're looking at, is to reprioritize that. Oh, I got to go back and do that because I do want to show you something that happens. So one of the, we'll go in here, 2 different types of way that you can score risks that are calculation. One of them is the standard qualitative, and that's the combined impact equals the maximum impact of all queries. So what it does is it looks at and says probability times the highest impact across the category. So if the highest impact is 5, you would have 4, and you had a probability of 4 to be 4 times 5 equals 20, and so your overall risk score would be 20. The combined impact will take all of the assessments that you've done for a risk. Let's say you've got a probability of 4 and you have an impact of 5 on 1 and on schedule, and 3 on cost, and 2 on safety. It actually takes all of those into account, and it sums them up, and then it in each category and normalizes, and it gives an overall impact of all the risks, not just the highest one. And sometimes you'll see, depending on how you have that scoring set up, you'll see some reshuffling of the actual prioritization or ranking of risk in your risk register. The other thing is, because we added this additional colors, you can see that we have this undefined. So we haven't defined it, and this is for the risk trend. If you add another color, we want to put it in the order that we think it is, from the lowest to highest here in terms of severity ranking. And we're just going to call this serious. Okay. And what that does, no, don't want to do that. And then we'll look at the risk trend, and we can see actually it gets added to the risk trend. So it tells us where these is, and you'll see this we've added this color in the risk matrix. So if you're using any of those, you add a different color. if you do add a different color, you'll want to go up into the risk trends, and you'll want to make sure that that's set up properly. Down below here, this tells us how we're going to be inputting and outputting the risk. So I'll give you a quick change. So if we wanted to show, we wanted to use the labels to do this, we'll go, okay, I'm gonna say no, but we'll go to the, and you can see actually now the percentages that we had have been changed to the labels that we have in there. If I go back and I say I want to show the index of the label, which is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yes. And you see that these are all changed to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sorry, changed to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if we went in, that's reflected in here as well. And let's see what it does. And there we go. Okay. And so that's when we do that format, that risk matrix, we're choosing how we're going to enter it and how it's going to be displayed. So typically the default ones that we'll have for qualitative is index of the label. For quantitative, it'll be, we normally use show percentage. So you're going to be entering in a probability as a percentage, and you'll be entering the impacts as a range. It can be a range of percentage. It could be with a statistical distribution. So again, this would be very critical when you're setting up how you want to look at that, or how you want to input and output that risk. Let's say other than in quantitative risk analysis from running against cost and schedule, the percentage is really the only way, let's say the only really valid way to do it. But if you're doing qualitative, it can be some different, you might have some different methods that you want to do that depending on user preferences. So click go out of there. Yes. I'm just going to say no. So for quantitative, so we've got, this is pretty well set up for quantitative. I'm just going to switch this over. Oh, no, okay, cancel. I don't want to save that. Oh, that's the wrong one. Okay. Let me just go back into here. Oh, I opened up the wrong one, of course. Let me just open this up. This is not, let me just go in. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know why that disappeared off my most recent. So one of the things when I set up quantitative, I want to, if you have it in the default settings, a lot of times what will happen is that you don't get the, and you look at the risk matrix, all of the risks end up being sort of grouped around in the green. It doesn't, and it, which normally is, you'll say, oh, well, that's on the watch list. because it doesn't take into account what that actually means in terms of in reality. So if I had a risk that was, and I'll just look at I'll go to the cost because that's got that built in there. If I said I had a risk that it was a moderate 10% of a budget, if that risk occurs, could be up to there, and it occurs on let's say a $200 million, well, that could be a $20 million risk. That's a significant risk if it occurs. And it should be, but on here, it would end up on this, and on here, it would end up in the green unless we had a very high probability. It wouldn't really sort of move properly, but if we can shift the ranges that we're using to reflect that. So if you look at here, what I've done is I go negligible is less than 1% of the budget. I made that the 1% range. Minor is 1 to 5% of the budget. It was right here. So these right here, this actually only represent 5% impact, whereas in the qualitative would represent up to 40% or something, or a range up to there. Moderate is 5 to 10% of the budget, and serious equals 10 to 20, and critical on this one is over 20%. So what I've done is I'm not going to say normalized, but I've modified the ranges so that better reflects the reality when we're doing quantitative risk analysis. And you would do this if you have a requirement to use the risk matrix as one of your reporting tools. Because again, what would happen if we didn't do that? Most of our risks would cluster down here, and we don't get a really good assessment of the risks that way when we're doing quantitative risk analysis. So I always, when we do that, if you're going to be using this, we will go through and we'll set up, and this may not be exactly how you want to do it, but you can set up these ranges. They have to equal 100%. So we can better reflect the impacts of the risk on the risk matrix. Okay. It's one of the issues. The risk matrix has issues. It's a very nice, quick tool as long as it to be able to say, well, here's this risk. We think it's up here, as long as it's set up correctly. And typically, we do see people are using it, and it's not being there. They want to look at it, but they haven't gone through the process of modifying the ranges in here so that it gets, when they're done their analysis, they can push out the risk matrix and it actually reflects how they're assessing the risks. And you can see here, because I've changed the settings, what is typically would be a very low score is showing in the red. And if we go to the risk matrix, you'll see that they've gone here. If I went back, and maybe I actually don't want, I'm going to just save this as an example. If we go here, I'm just going to go save as a test. If I go back to the format risk matrix and I say restore defaults, you can see what happens. So all of those risks have now been shifted down, and so they wouldn't be in. Whereas if we modified that, we modified the no, I'm just going to go back to that. Because we modified that, we can actually use the risk matrix as a reasonable reporting tool, an assessment tool. doing a quick look to see if we have any questions. No questions so far. Okay, so now we're just going to go in and say, look at all the sort of customization that you might want to look at when you're setting up your risk register. As we showed, I'm going to switch over to the, of course, that's disappeared. Okay, I'll have to start. If this, I have to go back to, if this is, so this is a sort of one of the sort of more complex setup. I'm just going to go back in and switch. Okay. So one of the things when we're looking at it and setting up, customizing, one of the things I think a lot of people, when we're looking at it, they're also with the risk, the risk can be in 3 different phases. There's the original, and that gets recorded in the risk history. So if we went over here, that would reflect what we have every time I save the file and update it or whatnot, it gets saved to here. But it reflects the original. This reflects the current probabilities. And one of the things you can see here is this has been set up so that we have, because these are original, they're sort of hard written in. This is the current assessment. And then this has been set up so that we can actually edit it directly in the risk register rather than actually having it, having to go into the probability and impacts, as we can see right here. The way that we do that, this is just one of the artifacts of the system, is we add a probability. It can be any one of the ones, but it has to be for a specific category, and that'll allow us to be editable. If we add the overall in probability, like post-mitigated, pre-mitigated, it will be, that's a calculated value across all, and it's not editable, but we can add that here. We modified this column, so the impact for the cost, modify column. So this is really for qualitative impact schedule, and you can see this modify column. So we can add all of these columns in. And one of the ways that I like to look at it, and because it helps both in the assessment and probabilities, is getting my, you may or may not do it this way. If we had risk plans, mitigation plans in place, this would start to get populated as well. I like to separate out I call it the assessment versus the other risk information. When we're setting up the risk register, if you're looking how do these columns get set up, when we modify the column, at the first one, we look at the header and we say how many columns is it going to span, and then we can give a header name, and if we want to put a tooltip in there, and then you can add a background color, an outline color, and it shows it in the it'll show basically what the overall what the header and the column header will look like. Well, that's interesting. That was not. Okay. So you can add these headers. Again, if you look at this, I'll just go and you can see that here. We want to add a header. It's just got current, number of columns that it's going to span, and the color. So we can, using these properties, or probably we can add that. Now at the bottom, I'm not sure if you were, you can actually create multiple views of the same risk register, of the same risk information. So I've set up the assessment versus the information that I want to set up. You add a tab simply by clicking here, and it's going to take the default view from the assessment one. I'm going to delete that. It's sort of like a tab in Excel. So on the information, I can move or copy it. I can add the color. So I just added a light robin's egg blue there to bring them up. And I can then go in and pull out different information. So I've kept the risk name on this one just because that's a good one. But then I started to bring in some of this other information across here. And so what we can do is, if you're printing out a risk registry, you can have your risk assessment on one tab, and you can print that out. And on the information, you can print that out, the other sort of information on there that you're capturing, rather than having to scroll great lengths across. Typically, some risk registers have a lot of information that they're capturing, and you may want to break it down in this type of using this type of methods or process. We've seen how you can set up the risk matrix and the risk trend. On the, if you're using the risk report, I'm just going to add that. You can customize it here, rather than there may be a lot of information that you don't want to have in there. So all of the properties that are in the system, again, this might be one of the reasons why you want to minimize this as much as possible. So you're just getting the stuff out, and you're not having to scroll through here to add or remove different properties that you don't want listed in some of the data tables. You can actually show pre and post mitigated cubes that are shown on here. Different labels. You can add your logo to a report, and you can say where the top left or top right, and we can actually go in and also add the different types of, there's properties that are captured for each risk in the system. There's a general properties, pre and post mitigation. There's that cost of risk calculation. So if you're using that with the cost of the risk curve times probability, get your expected value, and then if you're having some, if you're doing some mitigations around that, or you have a response plan, you can add all of the costs of those to do, to bring out what the expected cost of that risk will be overall, with mitigations, risk reviews, custom process. You can include the waterfall chart, and you can change the, so these are really set reports, set report, the type of data that you can pull out. And you can change, you can remove them, or you can change the order. There's not really a lot else that you can do to this particular report, but if you are going to use it, you may want to come in, take a look at this, and again, as much as required, as little as possible. And you can print out, basically we print out as many of these as you would like by selecting them, and you can send it off to a plotter or a printer, and we'll print those out. Lastly, on the risks, it does have some filtering and sorting built into it. Quick sorting, if you want to do it by names, alphabetically. This is by risk score. And if we had the ID, it does have a built-in ID, but it's just not, I haven't shown it here. We can use that. My default is the prioritization. You know, from my standpoint, it's always about risk prioritization as opposed to, you know, the ID. There might be some times when you're looking around, but I always want to know which are my most critical risks at that current time. You can actually use the hierarchy if we want to take a look at the risks and their assessment per category. We could look at it that way, whether they're open and closed, all of these different ones. Owner, if you wanted to say who's, you know, the ownership group, we don't have actually. I don't think we have any owners on there one. So it will break it down by the different owners. Really, and those properties are somewhat hard coded. You can do filtering, and this is sort of Boolean logic, and again, it's based on the you could say equals and Bob, because I know I have that, and that's interesting. Oh, so this is a different one right here. I would have to say owner. Risk owner equals risk. Fortunately, these aren't. Oh well. Here. I don't know where I put that now. Anyways, I'll have to find that at some other time. Okay, but you can create a filter, and it's using Boolean logic, basically a filter risk name equals or contains or doesn't equal, and the value, and then you can add and or, and you can create a Boolean logic in your risk filters and go and click OK. It's probably going to do nothing there. So I'm going to go clear all, and we'll go back to. So just on this is you can use the filters to change it, what you want. You can add, to go over quickly, you can add, you can insert column before, after, modify the columns, which are the properties, or hide columns. Once you've set it up, one of the things you do want to do is you want to save that column layout. It's going to save it there, and that will save the column layout throughout the entire project. And that is available always up on the, if you click on the top of the column, you can see that there. I'm going to risk owner equals Bob. Okay, and I'm just going to clear that. So you can set this up however you want. It's fairly flexible. We haven't yet met a risk register that we can't recreate within the system, but you know, I'm never going to say never because it could happen. But it is a fairly flexible underlying structure that allows you to, depending on your situation, you'll be able to set up the risk register. So it's really following and doing what you want it to do, rather than if you just come out and you start off and you're using the default settings. A lot of times what we do see is that it doesn't really, it's not performing the function that the people want it to do. And they're not quite aware of how to set it up. So I hope, and maybe we'll see if we have any questions, if anyone that people who are interested in using the risk register as part of their project risk management processes, that they can use this webinar, or and we do have some tutorials on our site to be able to customize it so that it mimics or it parallels any processes that you have within your organization. So with that, I'm going to open it up to see if there's any questions at this time. And if there isn't any questions, I will be coming in, and I don't see any. I'm going to end the webinar at this point. I hope you enjoyed it and found something interesting in it. If you do have any questions, you can always get a hold of us at sales or support at mtaber.com, and we'd be happy to help you out. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you in the future.